Well, welcome back everyone to our final session. I think everyone's a little tired. Puja's asked for some softball questions because you guys have really pushed it hard all day, but so we still have some interesting questions. We hope to we have enough for several hours, but we will certainly not give you the fullness of it. Let's Solène introduce our speakers, and then I'll talk for a minute before we ask some questions.
Thank you. So, well, John Bach has specifically asked me not to introduce him, so I suppose you all know him, as well as you do Puja, in fact. So I will then introduce Mr. Siddiqui. So Taha Siddiqui, Taha Siddiqui is an award-winning journalist living in exile in Paris since February 2018, where he moved with his family after surviving a kidnapping and assassination attempt on his life for his journalistic work. In Pakistan, he worked for many international media and received the prestigious Prix Albert Londres in 2014 for a documentary on the issue of poliovirus in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Since moving to Paris, he has launched his bar, the Dissident Club, and has authored his autobiographical graphic novel entitled, like his club, Dissident Club, published in 2023. He also manages two digital news media platforms called South Asia Press and Safe Newsrooms, focusing on the underreported and censored stories from Pakistan. Taha Siddiqui is also a regular visiting faculty at Sciences Po, while regularly working with various French and international media organizations. Then our next speaker, Indiana Lods. So Indiana Lods is a fourth-year PhD student working on the representations of monstrosity in Afrofuturist and speculative South African and American literatures under Professor Mélanie Joseph Villain. She is currently an ATER, so a teaching and research fellow at the University of Burgundy, where she teaches English. Her research in literature is grounded in history and sociology and examines the way reality is explored through a speculative lens. She took part in Jorlitsaf, a two-year collaborative project between IDEA and the University of the Witwatersrand, founded by Protea, and headed by John Bach and Leslie Cowling. The project focused on narrative journalistic traditions in South Africa and in France around the Second Anglo-Boer War and the post-apartheid period. The Jorlitsaf project allowed her to work on South African creative nonfiction and on historical fiction, which led her to write an article on Fred a historical novel by a South African author whom she was able to interview in October 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Solène. Okay, we've been speaking a lot today using the term literary journalism. It's a term we throw around casually, and I'd like to just take a couple of minutes and get our definitions, sort of like tuning our violins before the concert. There are various terms to use, if you will. The differences between, say, creative nonfiction, literary journalism, literary reportage, narrative journalism, reportage. How are they the same and how are they different? Partly our discussion here is going to just sort of go on the notion of a narrative journalism, the idea of using narrative arcs to help tell true stories. The question of true, though, of course, becomes one of the bigger issues. It's not so much the literary side of it, but it's the journalistic side. Certain artists, certain writers allow fictional elements to enter because they need to protect their source, for instance, not just because they want to add flair to their book. Other writers say, no, that's impossible. There are no composites at all for characters. Everything you write, including the dialogue, has to be registered at some point. So there are strict and there are less strict in terms. And our two writers today use different forms of narrative journalism. And I think just our first question, nice soft question, is how do you understand your own writing within a narrative journalistic tradition, either in India alone or Pakistan alone, or on a more global framework?
I think, as you said, some are more strict, some are less strict. And because I have been put through some scrutiny because of few controversial stories, I have moved to being more strict. So I think earlier I was a bit lenient, especially when it came to reconstructing from memory, as I did with Gangster on the Run. But now I think everything is verbatim, everything is true to the and the thers. So I am very strict now. But as far as narrative journalism is concerned, I am actually new to the form when it comes to journalism, because I just did a story which I think would qualify as the perfect first piece of narrative journalism, which is about this media publication, Media House, which was started to raise Dalit issues. Dalit are a minority caste in India, and to raise their voices, she started this publication. And that story is about 6,000 words. It has a beginning, middle, and an end. It has a narrative arc. It has plot points. It has what they call TRDs, which are twists, reversals, and dangers. So I think that follows the tradition of conventional narrative journalism. But otherwise, I don't think I mean, that long form story also, I don't think I had any idea about the art, because I think it's a completely different beast. And I hadn't really, I've done narrative journalism, but I was never serious about it. But now I am diving into it with a lot more enthusiasm and a lot more knowledge about it. I've read a few books. The one I recommended the other day was also Storycraft, which is a beautiful book on narrative journalism. So I think now I'm getting more into it. I was never into it.
Did you come across it in England when you studied journalism at all?
No, not really. In fact, in India also, you have a very handful of publications that do narrative journalism, and that was not proper narrative journalism. Like, they are long stories, but then they're not narratives. So you see that it's what you see in a Harper's or a New Yorker. You do not really see everywhere. I mean, like even the New York Times publishes long reads, but I don't enjoy those because they're not really narrative journalism. Yeah.
Taha, in terms of, have you dabbled in literary journalism or narrative journalism before the reportage book? Well, I mean, to begin with, I would say that like, how do we define narrative journalism, and what form or what medium we're using for reporting narrative journalism. So there is, for example, the form of writing books or a comic book, which I did. There is text-based article forms like New Yorker, etc. Then there is also documentary making, which is also part of this sort of narrative journalism that we do. I mean, at the core of all of this is storytelling and how we tell stories. And I think, I've been reporting for around about 20 years as a journalist. And in the beginning, when I got into the career, there was this whole idea that, you should remain non-biased, you should remain independent, you should, have objectivity. But 20 years later, I think, those things are sort of a fallacy, and I think we are always selecting things to tell. There's always a selection and a bias in the way we tell stories, whether it is about the quotation we will choose, or the person we will interview, or the way we will develop the story. All of that has that personal bias in it and personal sort of narrative. So what may be a way of truthful reporting to one journalist will be very different to another journalist, and we have to accept that. And I think we have to understand that, and sort of have that media literacy, and then look at what narrative journalism might be. To coming back to your question about whether or not I delved into journalism like this before, I actually, before writing this book, I was doing long form journalism in Pakistan, what we would call features writing, or what we would call investigations, but with the human element, with
giving faces to stories of, for example, human rights abuses in Pakistan, or and you find characters, and it's just as like fiction is. You have different characters, you have the good, you have the evil, you have the tension, you have the fight, you have the beginning and the end and the middle. So all of that goes, I think, into every kind of journalism that I've been doing before. But this was different in a way because this was about writing about my own self, and then writing from my own memory, and delving into my own past. So that was also another experience of when you write about others, it's very different when you write about your own self, and how you want to tell your story, and how people will perceive you after you've come out and sort of expose yourself in different ways. That also matters when you're writing about yourself. So this was this had several different experiences combined into one when I was writing this. But I also think that because I worked with a cartoonist who was from the French cartoon industry, or the comic book industry, or the graphic novels industry, it helped me sort of. He was not a journalist, he was a diplomat, ex-diplomat. He lived in Pakistan for some years, and that's how I got to know him. And he did a book on Pakistan with another journalist, so I thought, I'll work with him. And so he had his comic book codes. There are like graphic novels, codes of storytelling in graphic novels. How do we, shape the dialogue? How do we tell the story? What do we show and what we do not show, and leave it to the assumption of the reader to sort of imagine it? Because I mean, this book talks about 35 years of my life, but it's 260 pages, and you can read it in like 3 hours. It took me 3 years to write it, but took me 35 years to live it. So we can't put everything there. So that's also, again, a pick and choose that we did. And I think it was good to work with a cartoonist who was not a journalist, to sort of like combine the world of comic books with journalism, and sort of produce this as something that is an autobiographical account.
So you had created the narrative arc of the comic book, then he brought ideas of the images to go with it? Were certain things edited out? This was not going to work, or this was going to work?
I mean, we work with an editor also. It was Glénat, the French editor, which is also someone that is that like a publishing house that is very well known in comic book world, and telling stories of autobiography, etc. So we worked with them, and I think the editor also was involved in the process of what should go in and what should not go in. My initial idea was to talk about, so it's an autobiography which talks about me coming into exile into France. And then I wanted to do flashbacks to my life before in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, where I grew up, and sort of like do a comparison. But then Glénat was on the thing that they wanted to chronological account of it. So that was the first change that I had to go through. But I'm adaptable and flexible like that. I think editors have a better idea of how books should be done. So we should listen to, I mean, there's different hierarchies in journalism and in all kinds of publishing. And I think, if there's advice coming like that, I want to sort of incorporate it. So the editor asked me to do a chronological sort of version of it. I went back and worked on it 6 months again to write the whole narrative in a chronological way. But then eventually I did slip in the flashbacks, because that's what you can do later on once you've signed. Well, anyway, but so basically, with the editor and the comic book with artist, what I did was that I wrote first a whole synopsis of the 35 years, what I wanted to show, and then we sort of like broke it into smaller parts, and then really smaller parts into like what the scene will show, what will not show. And then there were instances where my cartoonist, because I mean, it's a lot of hard work for him. So he was like, this is a lot to draw. This is a lot to, it's already, the idea was the book was supposed to be around 200 pages, but we went up to 260 pages. And I wanted more. And he was like, this is a lot of work. I wasn't paid for this much work, because publishing, again, doesn't have that much money. But he eventually, I had to talk to my editor, say that, no, I would like this scene into it. So there was a lot of back and forth like that. But I think I had to, the storyline was that I drove the story, I created the story, and then I sort of ensured what scenes would go in, and then there was some resistance, but then that's part of the creative working process, to sort of like, work with another person and create something.
One final little follow-up, and I'll let Indy ask. So both of you are writing what could have been biography or autobiography. Why did you not choose the traditional genre, write your own memoir in a traditional way, or write a biography of Rahul?
With me, mainly because I wanted to, I mean, he is a criminal, was a criminal, and I did not want to give, just his account and his life. I wanted it to be reportage because I wanted to provide an all-rounded view of who he was, what the law enforcement thought he was, how popular culture shaped him, everything. So, I mean, I did not want it to be just about him. I wanted it to be about the entire Mumbai underworld, the entire society, and I think that's why I chose the form that I did. Yeah.
In my case, actually, when I first started working on this project of writing an autobiography, it was a few publishers that came to me and said to do a traditional sort of memoir. And they said that, why don't you do a memoir? And like they'd read about me in the papers, or when the attack happened. And they were like, we would like your point of view on what's going on in Pakistan, but with your own personal sort of autobiography. And at that moment, when I started writing the first few pages of that, I showed it to a few journalist friends of mine, French journalist friends of mine, and one of them said that the story was so visual that they were like, "Have you heard of like comic books?" And I was like, "Yeah, I mean, I've seen them, but I don't know how to do one because I don't draw." And it was like, in France, there's this big market, and it's considered to be the 9th art actually recognized by the government here, or the state, French state. And so I realized that, okay, this could be from that perspective, something that an artistic sort of work, also not just a journalistic work. But while it is an autobiography done in a comic book format, it's also for me a sort of recount of geopolitics. And I've used my own life story as a vehicle to tell that story of Pakistan, of growing up in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, in a Muslim family, then different aspects. I have my family members in it, which each family member sort of represents a different issue in Pakistan or in a society that I come from. So that's representative of it. So it's a kind of a geopolitical, social commentary on what is going on in these regions, but using myself as sort of a vehicle to tell that story.
I was going to ask that question to him. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, it allows me to bounce right back to my question. I was wondering about your use of voice, of your own voices in your work, of your use of the first person. Of course, with Taha, I mean, it's based on your story. So I was also wondering how you managed to maintain critical distance with your subject, not, yes, using your own story, but not necessarily making the book about yourself because of that geopolitical take. And for Puja, I was wondering, in Gangster on the Run, you embody almost Rahul's voice. We have comments like Rahul thought this or that, to the point of almost not appearing as a narrator. And I was wondering also how you maintain that critical distance.
I think for me, I relied on a lot of opposing views, and that helped me. So I always do that. I have views that contradict the mainstream narrative, but I can't have myself say that. So I have other people say that. And that's what I tried to do with this also. There are counselors who are criticizing him. There are his parents who talk about the madman he had become. and how he would, just keep, he was taking so much drugs that he would just put the shower on, stand under the shower and not get out of the washroom for hours. And so I think to balance it out, I basically use other people's voices, and that's really my trick.
I mean, telling a story in first person and telling a story about yourself, as I mentioned earlier, it can get a bit sort of, it's cathartic also, that it's sort of like, and one of the main reasons to actually go on and do this project was to understand myself also, because a lot of times from the society I come from or from the background I have, when you meet people around me, I'm very different, and I was always curious about why. And so the book really helped me sort of like dot those points down and sort of like find that sort of development into my own life. But sometimes it became, and that distance that you were talking about, it became so much sort of, I became so much involved in writing about myself and writing about memories that I had forgotten, and then I had to remember them, and some of them were painful. That it also at times for 3-4 weeks I would have like a writer's block. I would not write. I would not send anything to my cartoonist. Then he would like complain, and then he would like ask me what's going on, and I'd be like, for you it might be just a project. For me, it's very personal. And as a journalist last year when the book came out, he told me that this was some like the first few pages of it, you see the attack, which I survived. And he was like, you had this traumatic experience, and then instead of forgetting about it and moving on, you went on and you had someone draw it so that you can always watch it. So it's like you're reliving it every moment. And so how does that feel? And I was like, but it's also the reason why this story is important is because it's beyond not just about me. It's about freedom of press. It's about freedom of religion. It's about just freedom in and the search for that, and the idea of that in these societies. So the story is beyond me. So I wanted to tell that story. But sometimes I would, and how I would come back from that sort of getting into that dark space about writing about myself would be that I would remind myself that, okay, Taha is a character in this book. So yeah, it had, and that's how my cartoonist also helped me to say that we started referring to Taha as a third person, which was a bit weird because it was about me, but I was now referring to myself as a third person. So, but this was, yeah, it was my first project like this, and now I'm working on the second one, so I'm much better at it. But the first one was a sort of like an experience as we went along, and learning from that experience as we went along.
I think narrative voice is something that changes from project to project. With Front Page, I did not need to be in the story, but it allowed me to have this omniscient sort of view because I was covering the story. So I think that was important. With Gangster, I did not need to be in the story, so that's why I'm not a part of the story. So I think it varies from project to project.
And actually, it's I am tempted to ask you, Puja. I mean, has it allowed you to understand yourself writing about? Because of course, it's what you just said, Taha. So
just the other day, somebody asked me a very pointed question, and that was, "Do you write journalism because you are afraid to write about yourself?" And I'm like, "Whoa, just read the book and shut up." But I was asked that, and I don't know. I realized that I have never written anything about myself, and I don't know why that is, and I'm still battling that question. So I'll get back to you in some time. I'll write you an email about it, but I really don't know why
I would say that I think whenever we're writing, as far as my experiences are concerned, there is a reflection of ourselves in whatever we write.
Yeah.
There's always a reflection of our again, the thing that I said in the beginning, our choices of selecting what we want to show, our biases, all of that plays into this. We always have our own sort of, it's hidden out there, but maybe sometimes it's very open like I did, but sometimes it's very, subconsciously done.
No, I think I'm just a very private person, and I mean, I can tell you everything about my life when we talk, but I don't think I'll be. But today, when people were reading excerpts from Homebound, and I was like, that is my mother, and that is me. And I mean, so I think I get it out that way and not very directly. But except for that period shaming report that I spoke about earlier today, I don't think I've written anything personally.
But it does tell us about you, the very choices of topics that you make. Your interest in history and in marginalized people. So
I think those stories are more important to tell, right? Like, what do I have to say about myself? I mean, I've had a very good life. Like, I don't have anything to complain about. I shouldn't be complaining about. I could be a horrible person and still go on. But no, I think I don't. Maybe that's the hour I should call her and tell her that I don't write about myself because I don't have anything to complain about. Yeah, yeah, that's the answer. Yeah.
All right. Okay, in Front Page Murders, you write, Puja, journalists are accomplished trespassers, or even better, stalkers. And later, journalists chiefly employ two methods of information gathering. They either convince their sources or offend them. One of the issues that differentiates, say, reportage writing from traditional news reporting is the immersive aspect. You're immersing yourself in someone else's life, and you talked about that this morning to a certain extent. But there's also sort of the Faustian bargain that you both take in your treatment with your subjects. The closer you get to your subject, the more they trust you, but you know you're still going to expose them. How do you deal with that ethically for yourselves, both exposing your own self and those around you who are involved in your life in the comic, and those who were involved in, say, The Gangster on the Run or even the Front Page Murder?
So, I think I've always battled with this question as to when is it okay to hug an interviewee? And I've never really found an answer because you tend to get too close, and but I end up hugging. I feel very strongly about things, and I end up hugging. But again, I think the trick is to maintain objectivity, and because even when you read Homebound is about it is completely about the migrant workers, and there's a clear political bias that I am against how the government treated it. But I've also written about the errors that the migrants committed. So, for instance, there's a person who goes on and murders somebody. So, I mean, I think what I do is of course, I have my biases, but again, what I try to do is I try to create an objective picture. I try not to let my biases rule what I'm doing, but of course, I'm sure they do creep in somewhere or the other. So, for instance, when I talk about Gangster on the Front Page Murders, I have interviewed the serial killer, and the main purpose was to get his side into the book. So that's how I try to make it objective. The people who have been accused, I've tried to get their sides as well, although they are criminals and murderers who are on trial. So I think that's how I try to bring.
Has either of your subjects turned on you and said, look, I thought that was confidential between us. I thought you were trying to get at my soul and not expose my soul.
No. So I think, context is important. As long as you do not do it in a dirty way and you do it because it's necessary to the story. I think it's very delicate. I mean, I'm not a voyeur. I'm not trying to exploit them. If I am, there have been sources who have been reluctant to speak with me, but then I have explained to them why I want to speak with them and why I want to have their stories. And I think I'm a pretty sensitive writer, and thankfully I've never had that problem with someone else, except for the serial killer. He turned around and he told me that, listen, I'm not happy with what you've done. But he was actually quite pissed. But then I had recordings and I hadn't misquoted him anywhere. So I wasn't in a spot. But there will always be people who will be unhappy with your work. And I think it's completely okay, because if you're pissing some people off, I feel you're doing the right thing. I mean, you're doing something right. That's why they're pissed off. So.
Yeah, I mean, continuing with that, there's just some saying that if you don't piss off with people with your journalism, then it's all public relations. So it's that. But I mean, I think in my case, it's very different because it's what happened to my life, and people around me and what happened to them through me. So sort of it's connected to me. So I have the right to sort of, recount my own experiences. But what I did was that when the French version came out, the names of all the characters are as per, because their family members involved, etc., are the same. But when the English version that we're working on now to publish that, I decided to change the names of the particular family members just to sort of, not get a reaction from them, because I mean, some of the things that I do portray or show involves things which were things that went on through my childhood, and I saw that happening, but they might not want to publicly expose themselves to it. So I think that one way was just to change the names, and sort of if they think, it resembles them, that's their own perception, but they know what they did. As far as journalism is concerned, I think, I mean, when I was reporting more mainstream reporting or doing my journalistic work, purely journalistic work before this, I think the idea was to sort of be a voice of the stories of the people who wanted a voice. So it was actually, they wanted us to tell their stories, and that's why we were telling their stories. So we kind of augmented, or sort of gave them a larger audience, larger voice for whatever stories they wanted to tell, whatever abuse they had gone through, whatever victimization they had gone through. And I think that's the kind of journalism I had been doing by focusing on human rights issues before this.
In your biography online, you mentioned comic books from Superman and Batman, and how you colored those as a child, but then as your father became more radicalized, your new superheroes became obviously religious figures within the Muslim faith. In terms of a comic book, are you a superhero in whether you intended it or not in your own day-to-day, in your own?
I mean, I'm the more principal principal character who carries on the whole book. So in that way, but I'm not sure if there's a element of heroism in it. I mean, a lot of people do perceive it like that, but I keep telling them that I just went through life the way I just wanted to go through life on my terms. I wasn't doing anything brave when I was reporting on issues that got me threats, because I was just thinking of doing my job. As a journalist, it's just about doing your job. You're not like going out there and, I mean, anyway, like recruitment in the military is a problematic position for me, but I'm not going out there and putting myself in the line of risk like that. I'm just reporting. And so that was what I was trying to do with this.
Did any of the other characters in the book, if they recognize themselves, did they ever come back to you and say, it didn't happen like that, you're misremembering?
No, it's in French right now, so the audience is hasn't been able to. The people I'm talking about in this haven't been able to read it. When the English version comes out, I will probably see if there is feedback like that. But going back to your point about the comic books, and so another reason why I really wanted to do a comic book was that because as a child, and that's the story in the book also, which is like, as a child, I wanted to sort of, I was not allowed or had access to comic books because of religious reasons in the family. So I thought that, if I could have a comic book of my own, and sort of it could be an act of resistance in that way also. So it was kind of like, getting back at that sort of feeling of not having the access.
Thank you. I was wondering about your relation to history and to your own country's histories. Because, as you mentioned, Taha, there is this geopolitical background to your own story that you explore. And you did mention flashbacks. So it seems to me that it's not only very contemporary history, but that you go deeper. And Puja in Front Page Murders and in Gangster on the Run, it almost feels like Mumbai is a character, and that you are also recounting Mumbai's history in a very layered way. And I was wondering if you thought of yourselves as historians in that way, as people who shape history, how it is told with orality, specifically for Puja. And what makes history?
So somebody called me a storyteller of history, one Indian publication, and I couldn't really understand what it meant. I was just writing a story, but yes, there was some sort of archival intention in my mind. And I think, there's a quote that says, journalism is history in a hurry, and I wanted some more space, to be on the shelf for longer. And I think that's why I did books, and that is my way of, sealing certain things in history which wouldn't be remembered. Homebound is an attempt at that. Rahul is an attempt at that, because this is a story that, nobody records. We have a long history of the Bombay underworld where you've had gangsters who've unleashed blood on Bombay street, but you do not have a single book about about a gangster who did something nice. So I think this was adding to the history of the Bombay underworld, but a different page. So yes, I think that was my intention, some archival value, but I think I did Homebound with that intention more than the other two books. With the other two books, I do not really think I had that intention. And as for Bombay as a character, I think Bombay in itself, in fact, the book that I'm working on right now also has a complete history of Bombay from 1984 to today, and how it enabled extremism. And I think I myself am very fascinated by the city, and that it has had such an interesting history. And I was just writing the other day that, there are three kinds of people who wrecked Mumbai: the lawmakers, the law enforcers, and the lawbreakers. The lawbreakers being the underworld, the lawmakers being the politicians, and law enforcers being the police. So I think I myself, it is very ingrained in me, and I think that's why it keeps coming back again and again. And I think it is responsible for a lot of things that did go wrong with Bombay, because Bombay has been a prized catch for everybody, whether it was its criminals or its politicians or its cops. Everybody wanted a piece of Bombay, and to get a piece of Bombay, they unleashed terror. Whether it was, dividing societies into Hindus and Muslims, or waging gang wars to get control over Bombay. So I think, yes, it has had a very great influence on me, and as well as the population of the city. And I think that's why it keeps showing up again and again.
When I was growing up in Pakistan, one of the books that really influenced me very early on was called The Murder of History. It's a book by this Pakistani author who, what they do is that they go through the Pakistani curriculum, and they find out how in the Pakistani curriculum in the schools, the narrative that is being taught to young people is a very fabricated narrative from the history of why 1947, the partition, as I call it, or the independence, as Pakistanis would call it, happens, and why it happened, why Bangladesh happened, what is the relationship with India, what is the relationship with the Muslim world. All of this has been somewhat murdered in Pakistani school books, because it's a completely made up narrative where there's a sense of this idea that this identity is created through the school books. And so when I was younger, and I went into this sort of like, when I found this book, and it was one of the books which is not very talked about, and it's really hard to get even in Pakistan. And that really led me in earlier years of my career of journalism to sort of like look into history from a different perspective. And then with this book, this is one thing that what I do is that every now and then you see a historical account of what happened. You see, the General Ziaul Haq's time, which was when I was born in the 80s, and the dictatorship, the military dictatorship. I explain it in the way that is not explained in the Pakistani mainstream narrative. Similarly, Benazir Bhutto's character. Then there is also the General Musharraf. There is, the military, the terrorism, what happened after 9/11, how Pakistan changed, what happened during the 90s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. It was like 30 years of that time period. And I think every now and then, an incident brings us sort of updated to what is happening historically, but from a perspective of, or from an independent, or independent, I don't know, because they will say they're independent too, but from my sort of the not the mainstream, and I think more closer to the reality of things, of not how the Pakistani state wants to say it. So that's why I mean, I think, yes, there is a lot of history, and geopolitics is sort of history in that way, that is recounted in the book, and that's why I'm really interested, and sort of very keen to see this book in English, so that, or one day probably in Urdu also, to the extent that it should one day probably becomes part of the Pakistani school curriculum when we start being honest to ourselves.
I really think, I'm thinking about history now. I'm thinking about history in my work, and I'm realizing that I think I am so obsessed with history, as you said. I just realized that I'm obsessed with history because the past explains a lot about the present. And I think I will stop using history when the past stops explaining the present, when we become so evolved as a society that we do not have a tumultuous past moving forward. So I think that's why I use history, because it explains so much about who we are now.
As the American in me, I thought we were progressing as a nation, but we're moving back to we're now writing the murder of American history, or we'll be soon writing it, without a doubt. Speaking of books that influenced you, what particular journalists perhaps influenced your writing style, your voice, your vision, your structure? If you feel that it's a journalist that did, or do you feel more drawn to a novelist? Both of you, I mean, in terms of
I think, when we were little, we saw Barkha. Barkha is an Indian journalist on TV, and she was the first one who went to Kashmir, which was very scary at the time, because, of course, it's a disputed region between India and Pakistan. And she went and she reported from there, and she was this heroic figure and woman journalist. And I really respected her, and I think that's how I started. I wanted to do journalism, but then, as I spoke this morning, the 26/11 terror attacks happened, and I went there, and I was obviously a student, and I was standing right there. Okay, I'm standing here, and there are people here smoking cigarettes. Okay, this is Barkha, and this is the hotel. Okay, people here are smoking cigarettes, and here she's down on the floor. I'm risking my life to bring you this coverage, and I'm like, oh my God, Barkha was sham. And so yes, I think my early inspirations did, how they say, never meet your heroes. So I think that was a complete loss for me when I actually saw Barkha. But I really enjoy reading writers, like, there is this Annie. I can't remember her surname, but she does this beautiful long form pieces that I really enjoy. There's a writer called Sarah Whitfield who I really enjoy reading. Of course, I started writing true crime because of Truman Capote in Cold Blood. I feel extremely inspired when I read an Isabel Wilkerson. She's written Our Bodies, Their Battlefields. I am actually reading, right now I'm reading a book called A Day in the Life of Abid Salama, which is life in Palestine, and I feel it's beautifully done. So yes, the list is long.
I came into journalism accidentally, actually. So I didn't really didn't know that I was going to do journalism until I became a journalist. Sort of, I had a finance degree, and I graduated from a business school. And then that was the time when, when General Musharraf, the dictatorship was just at the end of it in 2005-06. So I joined the media as a financial analyst and went to become a journalist. But very soon I sort of was disappointed in the Pakistani journalism industry because it was completely censored and controlled, and there was a lot of self-censorship, in fact, because of the fear and intimidation. It's understandable now I look back, but at that time I was very frustrated with it. And then I moved to the international media, and I sort of again did a lot of on-the-job sort of learning and experience about it. And I think I had my own style. I wasn't really influenced by anything. I tried a lot of things. I've done radio, TV, print, online, and then now this sort of autobiographical sort of book. But I mean, if you would have asked me 5 years ago that, oh, you're going to do a comic book one day, I would have said, no, I don't know. What are you talking about? But when I was growing up, I did read Persepolis, Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis, which is basically, she Iranian woman who came to France also, and then wrote about living in the, during the Iranian Revolution, so-called revolution. And so basically she did a book, and then it came out as a film also, and that really I really enjoyed her sort of account of how she was ironic and sarcastic and talking about religion and growing up in that society, which was very hypocritical. I think Pakistan also is very similar in that many ways in that way. So when I wrote the book and it got published, a lot of people, journalists who have started doing this comparison. So this work sounds like Persepolis, or this work sounds so I perhaps I think, I mean, I didn't actively got influenced by it, because that was long time ago that I read that, and then I did this book. And there's also another author in France called Riyad Satouf, who has done this book called Arab the Future. So somebody called did a review about this book and called it the Dissident the Future. So they sort of made that comparison also. But yeah, I think I do not have any styles to look up to, and yeah, I do my own thing mostly.
The final question before we do that? No, sure. Choose along with that.
We were actually wondering who you wrote for, which audiences, and we discussed the possibility of having one of your books adapted onto the screen, because it's very popular. I mean, true crime, but also, of course, individual accounts. So yeah, who do you write for? Which audiences do you have in mind? And have you thought your work could be adapted?
What book?
One of the dark sides of reportage books, of course, is that they do become Hollywood blockbusters. And the question we often ask is, is the writer aware of that, choosing the subject because they know it's going to lead to a six-figure?
I'll tell you very honestly, I knew this one was a film. Yeah, absolutely. I knew this one. And the rights are with Netflix.
And how did that sway your writing? If you knew, I mean, did you see the book then as scenes on the screen?
No. I don't think it influenced my writing, but I definitely knew there was a film in it. So, but that's not the reason why I wrote the book. I really thought that was an anomaly, but I was very aware that there's a film in the book. So I don't think it influenced my writing. If you read front page and if you read this, I don't think you'll see a real difference, because they are written, with similar cliffhangers, and the narrative flows in a similar manner. So I don't think it influenced the writing, and I will not admit this, but I should, because there are students in the room, and it's okay to write a book if you see there's a film in it, because money is important. And I am a journalist who's passionate about causes, but I want money as well. So that's why I was doubly happy that I was doing this book where there could be a film.
And email for the...
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, when I started working on the book, I thought of going for animation at the same time, because a friend of mine did that actually. He did a comic book and animation on Arte at the same time. It's called Parfum de Iraq. But I found out that the budgets were crazy, and I mean, for making animation. So I just stuck to what was low budget sort of a way. But because I come from a television background, so there's a lot of visualization, as I explained earlier. Like the story is very visual. And because of that, I think it had this potential to be turned into a film or an animation. And last year it got selected at the Biennale, the German Biennale Film Festival, as one of the 10 books to be adapted as a feature film. Plus, recently, a film production has bought its rights and there's a director working on adapting it for screen, again, the financing is where we will see how it goes, because financing a film is a very different ball game. And so, yeah, so I mean, my part in that is I'm just a consulting writer. So the film production will happen or not happen, I don't know. But I think, initially, I mean, when I was writing this one was for French audience because it was going to publish in France. So with the English version, I've slightly tweaked it a little bit for the American or the English speaking audience in that way, so that it's you know, the jokes are different in a slight way, not too much different. But you know, you have to remember who are you writing for, who your audience are, what the market is. You have to adapt and you have to be flexible as a writer, because you know, if you're rigid, then it doesn't make it through. And I think that's what was in my mind also, and especially because it was my first project, I wanted to be as flexible as possible. And now I'm happy, but now the film director that's working on it, he's adapting it to screen, so he's changing a few things. We sat down together and we talked about that also. When initially the book came out, I was like, okay, great, it's out. You know, it's my autobiography done in the French market. You know, in one of the largest markets in the world for comic book graphic novels. I was happy. Then I found out that it was being translated to Portuguese, then to Polish, then to German, and now to English. And it's like available in five languages, and then might become a film. So anything beyond publishing this was extra.
The writers will not tell you that, you know, oh, I want a film to be made. Who's going to say that? Everybody wants to sound literary and, you know, like I did it for a cause, but everybody wants it. And it's just that they won't admit it. But it's not easy. I gave away the rights in 2018 and the pandemic hit and I got a lot of money.
Most of the adaptations, of course, are going to change what you wrote. Are you, I mean, these are your children to a certain extent. Are you willing to let them grow by themselves and watch a director alter your voice, your work? I mean, like Mark Bowden, when he did Black Hawk Down, the film that they made of the original reportage was nothing like the book. And he said, I gave up rights.
So I think you have to be smart about that. So because I have been a crime reporter, I'm very smart about my contracts. So I have some creative control. Of course, they have the right to, you know, fictionalize certain elements or what they call the creative license. But because this is the true story of a real person, we held back some rights to make sure that, you know, it's extremely true to the narrative. So I think it really varies contract to contract, and you can have some control over it. Yeah.
This is a round table, not just a panel. So please, let's open it up to the audience. If you have questions for the remaining 15 minutes or so. Vanessa.
Yes, Vanessa, because I've answered so many questions. Yes. If Vanessa has another question.
You can have a break. No, you can have a break, Puja. So Taha, you're on the grill now. No, because I find that very interesting that the book was written for a French audience to start with. And I was wondering whether when you wrote, I mean, the book, for it to be a comic book, you adapted, I don't know, adapt is not the right word, but are there any cultural references? Because you know French society very much, you've been living here for a long time. So are there any references that you wrote in a specific way for a French audience or not necessarily?
I think that was, I tried doing that myself also, but I think the cartoonist really helped me because he grew up here. I didn't grow up here, so still I don't have that kind of a connection, but I do know the French society, living here for 7 years almost. But I think the partnership with the cartoonist did help to sort of, and we did like go back and forth on a few things to understand how that could be, you know, the storytelling could be done from a French perspective. So, you know, the kind of the style of speaking or the style of, you know, responding or, you know, using a cuss word or things like that. There are a lot of like these, you know, surprise elements, etc. But when you read it, you get this feel that it has, it's been, done with keeping a French reader in mind. But that was important for us because the first aim was the French market.
And then, so you talked about the English or American version where you changed some of the jokes. Does any parts of the story change as well, or it's only in language that?
No,
that
it's just semantics mostly, because I mean, as you speak English also, and I don't know if you speak French, but the approach of language is very different when it comes to explaining things, when it comes to humor, when it comes to responses, even like emotions, anger, happiness, sadness. All of these things are, very contextual to a language. Once you work with different languages, you realize that. And I think in that way, I contextualized it when it came to the American version of it. The story didn't change because it's the same boxes and same characters and same everything. But somewhere or the other, to sort of like slip in an explanation in a different way, so that it's more and also because the French audience have a much lesser understanding of the South Asian world, but the American or the British world or the English speaking world has a much larger understanding. So in that way also, we can take a lot of things for granted that the audience will understand it anyway because they know it. But in the French way, we're more explanatory in those things. So those are little minor differences and changes. No worries.
Maybe one last question, and in terms how, it was a hand up or did you?
Don't be afraid to ask me questions. I'll answer, I promise.
How has your time in France now? I know it's only been
Month and a half.
month and a half,
Yeah.
7 years. Has it changed you at all in terms of how you both perceive journalism, perceive writing, perceive your own voice developing? I know it's not a long time yet, and they've been keeping you busy, so you haven't had a lot of time, for that. But even for you, Taha, for 7 years, do you find that your own journalism has changed since leaving?
I think, I mean, yeah, it's always evolving and you're learning new things. Journalism is sort of not static in that way. I think I've also, this whole idea that I said in the beginning also about objectivity and about, don't become the story, which is what we were used to hear when we were like getting into journalism. You're not the story, you're just telling the story. This is, I think now, I mean, in retrospect and in what I have learned now is that you are very much part of the story. What you're telling, you affect it as you're telling it, and you need to remember that. And it's very subjective, and that's something that I think has come from my sort of me delving into another sort of aspect of journalism where it is about fighting for freedom of press, becoming an activist as a journalist, because this is also a very long debate between whether are you a journalist or you're an activist. I think you're both at the same time, and I think I accept that, and people need to see it in that way. And that's some of the evolutions that I've seen in myself by sort of because also I was reporting in Pakistan, and I've now had that distance from Pakistan. Now I do more analytical work on Pakistan. I write still for I've reported, I've done analysis editorial pieces on Pakistan, but not done reporting as I used to in the field before. So that also has brought a little bit of change in the way I write. And then now comic books is something that I'm like delving into, and then sort of now second book is also a comic book that I'm writing right now, and it's something that I feel like is a new form of journalism that I've found very sort of enjoyable, because the way you can tell the story with the creative license, it's so large, and you can have such a large audience, from young people to the old people, and you don't need the visual support that you need for making documentaries, and it's not as boring as just reading text. So it's somewhere in between, and I think it's it's this creative journalistic practice that I've sort of taken up, and I think I'm enjoying that now.
All of the day, a long day. Okay, please join me in thanking our two guests again.
Anybody who wants to look at the book, it's here.
Yeah. Oh, is it? I thought hard copies of the book.
Yeah, I brought it the English version.
So does this have the changed names?
Yeah.
Okay, so just before everybody leaves, I'd like to thank you all very much again for participating, for attending, for organizing, helping and everything. The whole team, the whole lot of you, both here and online, if there are still people online. A great many thanks again to the organizers, to, well, invitees and our students and colleagues for everything. It's been a great day, a busy one, plenty of food for thought. There'll be more projects. You know, John will be working perhaps again with Taha. I'll tell you more about that in the coming weeks or months. And while the Ariel residency goes on, obviously, Puja is with us until January, so we'll make the most of her. Try not to exhaust her too much.
No, I'm happy. This is misinformation.
Great many thanks to Dorian as well for the technicalities of the day, to all our master students for presenting, for the great questions that Willis and Ines prepared as well for the previous sort of round square table. Well, and again, Barbara and Céline for the whole residency. So thank you very much again, all of you.
Thank you.
Very nice, Taha. Congratulations.